I once heard a PT say that a weak muscle is a tight muscle. So when you're addressing your unique little puzzle that we all kind of have, and you come up, you know, to a muscle that is tight, especially tight. Generally speaking, if you speak to a normal, everyday kind of a person, they will say, well, it only makes sense if something is tight, you stretch it. And for the longest time, I thought that as well. But then I heard this PT say that a tight muscle is a weak muscle. And you should not stretch a tight muscle because it is weak for a reason. This idea stayed with me for a few years now, and I've spoken about it on the channel a few times. And I've had heaps of conversations around this statement over this period. A lot of guys have come up with situations in the body, in the biomechanics, where they might not kind of ring true. But I think for the most part, it is a good sort of statement to think about and to plan your training. Now, I have, and I'm sure all of you guys have, had tight hamstrings. Like, hamstrings are one of those things that for us, people who spend a lot of time sitting, especially in the Western world, if you're sitting on a 90-degree chair, you would understand that the hamstrings get tight. There's been a lot of specialists, in the sporting field who have, specialized in the hamstrings and have kind of tried to work out what causes a hamstring tear. I've heard things like don't do lying hamstring curls. They're really bad for the hamstring. They predispose you to hamstring tears. I've heard things like do Nordic ham curls, right? Instead, Nordic curls. They're much better because the glute's involved. So anytime you're training the hamstring, you should have the glute involved, because those two guys, the glute and the hamstring, are involved together in hip extension. So I've kind of heard that over again. And so thinking about the statement, a tight muscle is a weak muscle, we should never stretch a hamstring that is tight, because it's a symptom of something, of a cause. And the cause is not the tightness. The cause in this circumstance is that it's weak. And when something is weak, it likes to lock up, tighten, shorten. If you look at our posture, when a person is scared, when a person is fearful, they don't spring their wings. We kind of curl up into a ball, if you will, and we kind of make ourselves small. It's kind of like this evolutionary thing. It's whether it's psychology or whether it's biology, I don't know what it is, but when something is at risk, we like to tighten up, because if we are weak and long at the same time, then we have a higher chance of tearing. If you think about it like a rubber band, if a rubber band is really, really long and really, really skinny and weak, high chance of popping. But if that same rubber band locks up and coils itself over, the same force won't have the same effect on the rubber band. I've been thinking about glutes. I've been thinking about those two relationships between the relationship between the glute thrusts, the hip thrusts, and something like a walking lunge, some sort of split squat action. One causes a lot of soreness, the other one doesn't. The walking lunge always causes me pains. Right now, it is 12 hours after the last workout, and I'm feeling it, man. Especially the outer glute, it's talking to me. But I never feel the glute work when I do walking lunges. So I don't feel it work, I get really sore. With the hip thrust, I feel it work like crazy, especially that machine. The activation is insane, man. Like, the pump is real. But then the following day, no soreness. And I hit it hard, and it was a novel experience. I hadn't done it in the past, so I haven't even conditioned myself to this exercise. It's the first kind of onset of working with this exercise, and I produced no soreness. So very, very interesting stuff. Some good discussions last night about it all. Kind of got me thinking about the whole kind of glute perspective, especially when it comes to the squat. So a lot of us struggle with the squat because we tend to lean over a lot. We lose our balance. And if we don't lean over, we kind of roll backwards and fall on our ass, fall on our back, roll backwards. And so for the longest time, when I first started kind of working out, I thought it was all good to do with ankles. And ankles would kind of be a great start. And I started with working on my ankles, got a bigger shoe, ollie lifting shoe. Man, sometimes felt like taking my wife's freaking stilettos and like, 1 meter freaking high heels and just, because if you squat on your toes, we're all perfectly upright. So one would logically think, fine, it's the ankles. Over time, I realized that wasn't the case. When I look at ollie lifters, when I look at, first world country people squat, yes, the knee travels over the toes, but not to a great deal. Not to a great deal. So I want to say that the ankle flexibility, the mobility is not some extreme out of the world thing to produce a flat back, an upright back. And yes, some of these first world country people, they have short femurs, but I've seen long ass femurs squat ATG. So then I started thinking it must be the hips. And over the years, I've kind of had success with working with hips. I think it's got to do with glutes. Of course, internal hip rotation, external hip rotation, you got to have that rotation in the hip capsule for you to kind of move through that plane of motion. But I think ultimately the glutes are a big part of this. If you have weak glutes and your glutes are tight, right? A weak muscle is a tight muscle. A tight muscle is a weak muscle. And you are going into a ATG squat, what are the angles involved? Of course, full range of motion in the knee and full range of motion in the hip. Maybe you could say also in the ankle. But the hip is extreme range of motion. With the knee, I don't know too many people who have problems with knee mobility. It seems like everyone can bend their knee fully. With the hip, it's a different idea. If your glute is really tight, you will need to lean over more to produce more of a moment arm. Because remember, gravity goes straight down. If we are perfectly horizontal in our spine, there's not a lot of moment arm into it because it's not perpendicular with gravity. And so the more we lean over, the more of kind of weight we are transferring into the glute, and the more force we are putting onto that glute so it stretches. So in a sense, if you think about it, the more you lean over, the more force you're applying onto the glute so it gives. So if you have a really kind of locked up tissue, you will lean more and more of that force to make it bend. But if that tissue is strong and supple, it might not need as much leaning over, much of that momentum, that torque applied to it for it to give into a hip flexion position. Yesterday, I did the walking lunges. This morning, my mobility is excellent. Even though I'm sore, I feel the hip is more pliable. I feel the hip is more happy to release and go into those ranges of motion. Obviously, I have not put on strength in a freaking 12-hour period, but there's something happening. The same was felt when I was doing Bulgarian split squats. The same was felt when I was doing the reverse lunges. And now the same is being felt when I'm doing walking lunges. I spoke about it yesterday. Yes, you can do bilateral glute exercises like a hip thrust, like a squat, like a deadlift. But with that comes pelvic shifting. What I mean by that, when you're doing a hip thrust and you lock your top position, so you are fully hip extended, you will be limited by the rotation of the pelvis, i.e. you will go into a anterior pelvic tilt, okay, if you have short hip flexors. But if you are doing a walking lunge, because one leg is going backwards, one leg is going forwards, we are locking the hip into position because rotating the hip anteriorly will put more pressure on the other side, and vice versa. If you rotate it posteriorly, the other guy will cop a bit more. So in a split stance, we lock the pelvis in and we make that glute tissue stretch beyond what I guess its comfortable position, and we lock the pelvis in, and voila, we have more range of motion, more end range contraction, and therefore I think this is why soreness happens. Been thinking about it ever since last night, thinking about this statement, and yes, this statement is not true in every aspect. I've thought about it for a long time, and I've kind of thought about the reciprocal, inhibition, the reciprocal kind of changes that happens in the body, especially the lower cross syndrome, the upper cross syndrome, this idea that, you have a tight and a weak muscle, and then you have an overacting muscle, say with anterior pelvic tilt. It's a classic example, right? Your abs and your hamstrings are weak, so they've gone long. They've just kind of lost the battle and they've gone long. So that's one part of the X. And the other part of the X is you have really strong and overactive quads, i.e. hip flexors. There's the rectus femoris, iliacus, and psoas. And then on the upswing of that second stroke of the X, you have the lower back, which is also, let's say, overacting and too strong. So when you have those two teams, a strong team and a weak team, you have rotation of the pelvis. So in this instance, you would say a tight muscle is a weak muscle, okay? Does that apply in this situation? Well, I squat every single day. I think my quads are pretty strong, right? I mean, I work on my knee extension every single day. So I've gone down the line of, okay, I have weak quads, let's work on it. I have weak hip flexors, let's work on it. And every time I've attacked it, there's a period of improving. But if I load that exercise too much, like with the hip flexion exercise, the psoas skills, if I load it too much, what I find is that my anterior pelvic tilt gets worse. But if I do super lightweight and for a lot of reps, something about high repetitions that kind of releases us. It kind of makes us longer. When I do that, then my lower cross syndrome, if you will, the anterior pelvic tilt, gets better. So in this instance, you got to be very, very careful about applying that statement, a short muscle is a weak muscle. A weak muscle is a tight muscle. But in the sense of the glute, it kind of makes sense to me, because I brought up the story yesterday about a fella who squats the same as me. He can do glute hip thrusts like nobody's business. He can max out the machine, and yet I struggle with one plate. And so I kind of concluded my glutes are weak, and walking lunges absolutely kill me. So if this glute gets stronger and happier to release, happier to go into end range of motion because it's just stronger, then I will have more upright squatting. This is where the confusion comes in. You have rules, you have theories, especially in science, especially in clinical experience in nursing. There are rules, but there's also exceptions. It is very, very difficult to make laws, to make theories, because theories can be disproven. You might have, an instance where 80% of people benefit from your law or rule. You'll have 20% that miss out on it. I'm not an expert at this, but I've got a really close friend who's a doctor, and he's kind of briefly talked to me about how pharmaceutical companies get drugs approved. It's funny how it all works. It's all statistics. So you have a drug released into the market. It is beneficial. It's gone through the drug trials. And this drug benefits 50% of people. But 50% of people in this drug trial don't see any benefit. The drug gets released because 50% of people get benefits. And every drug, especially with this COVID era that we're in, every drug that gets released has some side effects to somebody. Obviously, if 100% of people have side effects, it's a bad idea, it's a bad drug. But you will always have instances where someone has a negative reaction. But that doesn't mean that this is a bad drug, because the majority are benefiting. So it's one of those things that no matter what we're dealing with, no matter what prescription we're dealing with in terms of exercise, or I guess even pharmaceuticals, you'll have situations where somebody disagrees. And this person has a correct argument. We should listen to this person. But disproving the rule, or disproving the drug or the theory completely might not be of benefit for the whole population. So this is where it gets really, really interesting. This is why I always say to you guys, you got to work out your puzzle. You cannot be a numbskull and just float through this journey that we call strength, squatting, deadlifting, benching, ollie lifting, whatever the case might be. You need to stay intellectually active. You need to start to understand what is actually happening here. and it's only going to be for your benefit. Like you can have a coach. I'm not saying I'm not anti-coaching. Definitely not. If you have the resources and you want to pay for a coach, somebody that's been in the business for a long time, who's been through some of these problems, heaps of times, definitely go for it. But that doesn't mean you're just like running around like a headless chook. You're like a robot. You go there, when they say, and that's it. Think about the process. I've spoken about this in the past. A lot of coaches that we see in the professional environment now have played the sport. A lot of these professional soccer clubs, NBA clubs, they recruit ex-NBA players, UEFA players, whatever, successful players. But sometimes you have coaches who are incredible coaches, and they were never the greatest player in the world. In fact, one scenario that pops up in my head is Michael Jordan, right? He's got a really bad track record as a general manager, as an owner, yet he was the best player. He's the best player that's ever touched the basketball, right? Arguably, I guess, to me, that's the case. He doesn't know how to manage the team, right? Maybe he doesn't know how to scout. Because when you're an experienced athlete, when you are a gift to a sport, maybe you don't have the same problems that somebody that's not gifted has. Michael Jordan would rarely get shot blocked or get his shot blocked, right? Because he's got this incredible ability to leap. He's got this athleticism. And so he doesn't have to worry about too many things that maybe a Steve Kerr has to worry about. He can't pull up in front of a 6'6" guy whenever he wants. He's got to work out. He's got to run around. He's got to run off screens and all this sort of stuff. So Steve Kerr has to go through a different cascade of thinking to get an open shot. So, I'm not saying that Steve Kerr is smarter than Michael Jordan, but you could make an argument that Steve Kerr has had more problems in his life to play basketball because he's less gifted. So in that same kind of way, in the same kind of line of thinking, I guess the more you struggle with whatever you're dealing with, say weightlifting, like I'm struggling with this thing called 300 kilo squat, I have to beat around the bush. I have to play with so many variables that when somebody comes to me and says, what do you think? I'm like, man, I've been there. I've struggled with this thing for years on end. So stay active mentally. Listen to your coach, listen to whoever, listen to many different sources, and just try and think about this. Try and work out your own puzzle. Try and work out what works for you. Even listening to me right now, you're like, man, if I'm just having kind of success with walking lunges, maybe I should try it. Definitely try it. Try it. If it makes sense to you and your puzzle, if it makes sense to you, do it. I try to kind of rationalize everything I do. I have to have a rationale for doing an exercise. I don't just do it for the willy-nilly. Oh, somebody said so. I think about it. Okay, so he's recommended for me to say this, for me to do this. How does that apply to my theory, to my understanding, to my knowledge so far? How does a weak muscle produce a tight muscle, and vice versa? Okay, does it work in every instance? A lot of instances worked. It's helped me. It's helped me. When I had problems with my calves, working on your calves, man, makes your range of motion longer in your ankle. I've done that. It's so weird, man. If you do a block of hardcore calf, seated or standing calf raises, your ankle mobility improves. Your arches improve. Your foot arch improves. It improves. Everything starts to lift and you become longer, stronger. It's weird. Enough of this black screen, guys. I've got to pack up and go to work. I'll catch you tomorrow. Peace out.